saying that this kind of applies to different objects, not just books and PDFs. So it applies to when you're shopping for a library book or looking at books in general, when you're looking for clothes or beauty products or anything you would buy online, and then also for things like furniture and interior decorating. So any object you're kind of viewing online, the way it happens now is you miss out on a lot of information about its physical properties, about the material it's made out of, and so on, because the focus is just essentially on the visuals. And this isn't necessarily a user interface problem, because in all of the examples I just showed you, the websites looked pretty and they were usable, but that doesn't mean that they're offering an effective user experience. And it's also not an issue that can be solved by just throwing virtual reality in the mix, because nowadays a lot of people feel that if they can make a model of the object and then present it in virtual reality or have it like rotate 360 degrees on the screen, then that solves the problem. But while that may give more information about the dimensions and the shape, it still doesn't convey things like the weight, the materials, the textures, and so on. So essentially, it comes down to two components. The first being that you want to digitally capture the materiality of the object that you're presenting. And then two, you want to curate an experience out of that. And here I just want to sidetrack for a second and ask, why should we actually care about this? Isn't it enough that a website or an interface looks good and it's easy to use? Isn't that enough? And the answer here is it's not that simple. Being a researcher, my first instinct is to kind of throw research papers at you that talk about how important this is. But instead of doing that, I'm going to talk about the heart and soul of any interface, and that's the user themselves. So as part of my past research, I've been talking a lot to experts who deal with these kinds of collections. And these are just some quotes they gave when I asked them what bothered them about current interfaces and websites that showed items, whether shopping or cultural collections. And even though the quotes are different, the one thing that's kind of in common between all of them is that all these people were longing for a material experience, to be able to walk away from the screen feeling like they've had a multi-sensory interaction that was as fulfilling and memorable as physical experiences with the objects that they were viewing. And if you're looking for hard numbers or statistics, the Louvre Museum in Abu Dhabi was able to increase their digital engagement by 50% without introducing a single new exhibit. So they had no new content. All they did was curate new experiences with the content that they already had. So they did things like making a series of podcasts with fictional stories around the museum objects, like you'd hear on an audio guide if you were walking around the museum, and so on. And they just used some of the techniques that I'll talk about in this presentation, and that alone was able to increase their digital engagement so much. So there is definitely something to it. You have your users and you have these digital objects, and if you can curate a materially digital experience, you can help users break away from the screen and increase their real-world understanding of these items. And this has so many benefits in terms of education and spreading culture, in terms of creating interfaces that are more accessible, and also in terms of how positively they perceive both the website and the institution or organization that created it. And obviously this has a direct impact on brand image and on profits. So now that I've hopefully kind of convinced you that this is important, let's go to the first step of curating such an experience, and that is digitally capturing the materiality of the object. And here it's very easy to fall into philosophical rabbit holes and ask, what is materiality and how do we capture this, and like how do we know the difference between the digital and the physical and all of that. But because this was a major component of my research, I'll save you all that jumping around and focus on the three main factors that you should take into consideration. So essentially, you want to find out your item's specific properties and affordances. You want to step away from digital aesthetics, and you want to handle real-life users and scenarios. So when it comes to the first step, you need to do some research on the items that your experience is going to handle. And for any object in general, no matter what it is, it will have properties and affordances. So properties are easy enough to understand. If we take the example of this red teapot, for example, examples of its properties would be things like its dimensions, its weight, the shade of red, the material it's made out of, how that feels, how much liquid it could hold, and so on. And depending on which philosopher you talk to, any object can be taken to be a combination of all its properties. When it comes to affordances, on the other hand, these are cues the object gives off that tells you how to use it without someone having to explicitly come and explain it to you. So if you imagine that this was the first teapot you ever saw in your life and you had no clue how to use it or what it did, an example of an affordance would be the handle, which would let you know that you can pick this item up and kind of move it around. Another example would be the knob at the top, which lets you know that you can take the lid off and put it back on. And then a third affordance would be the spout, which lets you know that maybe something pours out of here. And affordances don't have to just be visual. So another example would be you tapping on the side of the teapot and then realizing that it's hollow, which means you can fill it up with the liquid. That's also a communicated affordance. And these affordances extend into the digital world as well. So by making this link, making this text blue and underlined, it gives off the affordance that you can click on it and that something is going to happen, even if the text wasn't a link in the first place. And this idea of affordances and how they serve as a silent form of communication between the user and the object was developed by Don Norman, who's a usability engineer and cognitive scientist. And you're probably familiar with this book if you're in HCI, but I recommend it to everyone because it's very insightful beyond the digital world. But that's kind of step one. And next, you want to focus on this representation that you have of your object. So we said you've already kind of figured out the properties and the affordances of this object. The next thing you want to do is translate this into the digital world. So essentially, your properties are going to get translated to digital representations and your affordances into digital interactions. And to truly kind of have a material digital experience, you want to step away from digital aesthetics. So you're probably wondering, what are digital aesthetics in the first place? And aesthetics in general are a combination of factors that lead us to subconsciously classify something a certain way. And this applies to anything in the world. So for example, I could say that this building's architectural aesthetic tells us that it's from the Gothic era just because of the way it looks. I could also say that this painting gives off an Oriental aesthetic because of its content or its subject matter. Similarly, if an item has a digital aesthetic, that means that something about it makes people perceive it as being digital. And this is independent to whether it's actually digital or not. So for example, this piece of art was created physically using a pen and a paper, but it gives off a digital aesthetic because of the glitching effect and the pixelation. And while you might think that this artwork was also made physically with a pen and a paper just because of all the squiggly lines and the etching, it was actually made digitally using a tablet. So the way something was made and the aesthetic it gives off don't necessarily have to go hand in hand. And there's been a lot of kind of academic work done on this in computer science, philosophy, psychology, and there are a lot of great resources out there to get you started on this. But in short, if you want people to have a material experience, you need to step away from the traditional digital aesthetics, like the perfect layouts where everything is the same size and all the spaces are equal and so on. And I'll give an example of this from my master's project, where I was essentially modeling a collection of science fiction books. And I chose to step away from this sort of traditional interface where, as I was just saying, all the spaces are equal, everything looks so clean and perfect, which are attributes that you typically give to digital interfaces. And instead, I chose to represent the collection using two visual metaphors that we're so familiar with in real life, which are the pile of books and the bookshelf. And these are essentially messier and less uniform, but they also leverage something that everyone is going to be familiar with or has seen before. I also put a ruler on the side of the screen, and this is not only just to help people use it as a reference to measure the books, it also kind of brings in this atmosphere of having a tabletop workspace where you have all your tools laid out and so on. And things like these can help the user break away from the digital environment and connect with the physicality of the objects, even if they're still staring at a 2D screen. So in short, if you want a practical, easy solution to implement, you should break away from digital aesthetics and try to immerse your users by representing the items in their natural environment in a more material way, essentially. And then the third step is to handle real-life users and scenarios. And what I mean by that is you need to understand who's going to be using your interface so you don't end up designing for the wrong person. And a really good example of, And you might think that that's easy enough to do, but essentially, if you don't know who your users are, you can design the best interface in the world, and it's still not going to be appropriate. And here, I want to step back and say there's so much new work being done on new kinds of interfaces and VR, and we can kind of interact in all these new and exciting ways. But right now, when it comes down to it, users can only interact with laptops and tablets in three ways. You have your usual clicking, dragging, and scrolling. And while that might seem constraining or limiting when you compare them to physical interactions, there's a lot you can actually do to bridge the gap. So again, there's been a lot of work done on all of these kind of issues which you can look at. But to explain this further for this presentation, I'm going to go back to the example of my beloved books. So when you interact with a book or with any item in general, it gives off a material meaning and a semantic meaning. For a book, the semantic meaning would be the text and what it's explicitly saying. And when you read a book, there's a lot of brain processing going on to kind of use your knowledge of language, understand the context, understand the content of the book, and so on. So there's a lot of conscious brain power taking place. On the other hand, the material meaning lies implicitly in the tactile properties of the book itself. So like the material of its cover, for example. And these meanings are more biologically familiar to us because they rely on our instincts and not on knowledge that we've previously learned. So this meaning helps strengthen our memory of the content of the book and of our overall experience when we interact with it. And this becomes more solid because this memory is then linked to a specific object and an event that happened in time and space. You can remember sitting down and reading this book on Sunday, for example. On the other hand, our digital interactions are more abstract and conceptual, and they don't really have that solid link to a specific object because we use our laptops and our phones for so many different things that it's hard to associate them with just one event or activity. So now that we kind of understand the difference in terms of brain processing between the digital and the physical, we can begin to design interactions that overcome these issues. So as I was mentioning a moment ago, the first step to doing that is to kind of understand who your actual users are. And here I want to use this example of a website by the Network of German Coins. And this is a really good example because this type of interface would have usually been aimed at researchers or coin experts and so on. So when you came to filter the collection, you'd usually find filter items like the date the coin was made, the minting place, and so on, which don't really mean much to someone who doesn't know that much about coins. But actually, they also make or do a very good job at accommodating for just the casual user who comes in and wants to explore this because it looks very cool. So they also have filter categories like the material of the coin, for example. And while this on its own might not be very valuable to a researcher, it's very inviting for someone who has no knowledge of coins to just come in and rearrange them as they would have in real life. And they also use these messy piles to be even more inviting for you to just start playing around and clicking on stuff and so on. So after you've kind of thought about all your potential users and not just specific ones, you need to anticipate as many scenarios as possible. So what will the user come in and do with your interface? And I'm going to use another example from my master's project for this one, where I kind of think of the scenario where you walk into a bookstore and you're looking for a book, and you don't remember what it's called or who wrote it, but you remember that the cover was red, for example, or blue. And because of this scenario, I put in my interface the functionality to be able to filter the collection by the cover color or search for a book by its color. And so many kind of people who tested the interface responded very positively to this particular scenario just because it was this very specific thing that could happen in real life, but that you could never kind of accommodate for in a digital interface. And even though it's not particularly valuable to a researcher, for example, and even if 2 users end up actually using it, it still helps people feel like they're in a more real-world setting. And then the final thing you can do, which maybe is where good user interfaces come in the most, is to offer a very engaging and interesting experience centered around the unique interactions people have with your specific product. So here in this website by a Danish company called Simply Chocolates, they really make use of the experience of ripping the chocolate wrapping open and biting off like a piece of chocolate from the bar and so on to really give you that satisfying experience as you would in real life. And they do that simply through the very accessible interactions of dragging down the screen and just scrolling down the screen. So that's interactions that everyone is familiar with and likely has access to. So coming back to the bigger picture, right now we can say that we've digitally captured the materiality of the object by thinking about its properties and affordances, representing those in ways that step away from the digital aesthetic, and then also accommodating for all our users and scenarios. This has all been focused on kind of showing one object and looking really closely at it and interacting with it. But how can you then curate an experience out of collections of these objects so that the user can kind of navigate between different ones? That's the last point I want to talk about today. So here, it's again very easy to fall into the trap of just following one of the many UX guidelines or UI frameworks that already exist and think that that's enough. And this is especially the case because now there are such detailed and specific guidelines for such like specific use cases. For example, this one covers only the display of online museum collections. So it's very easy to think if you're doing all these things and you're checking off all these boxes that that's enough. But at the end of the day, providing a material experience goes beyond just these metrics. And here, let's just take a quick look again at some of the things that people have said were missing, even though the websites they were looking at all followed some sort of UI UX guideline. And again, the common theme here is that even if something has a good UI UX process, it is still missing something when it comes to showing collections of objects. And we can essentially boil this down to two different concepts, which I'll briefly introduce right now. So the first one is the importance of showing both connections and context. And if we take an example of this vase, for example, and let's pretend we're either selling it online or we're displaying it as part of a cultural collection. An example of highlighting its connections would be to direct the user to other Chinese vases, for example, or other items that are made out of the same material of porcelain, or other items that were made in the same region or workshop. And then an example of highlighting its context would be to tell the users more about the location and the process of creating the vase, as well as all the different people that were involved. And this way, the user can think of the item as a real-life object that exists outside the digital realm and is related to other objects and exists in a certain space, and not just as pixels in a screen that exist in a vacuum, essentially. And the second concept is to provide both overviews and details. And this is pretty self-explanatory, so I'll just give a quick example here from the Digital Bodleian. So essentially, it's their online library collection, or collection, sorry, of artifacts and archives. And it's tailored across 3 levels. So when you first come in, you can see all the items in a collection, all the books here, for example, or manuscripts. And then when you select a specific item, you then get another overview of all the pages or the components, which is the panel on the left. You also get a lot of details or information about the object in the panel on the right. And this information covers both content-related information and material information. And then the third level is the one in the middle, where you can really kind of zoom in, drag around, rotate the object, and get such a detailed view of all the material properties, like the color, bleeding, or any stains on the page or scratches, especially because these are historical items and these features sort of have a lot of meaning hidden within them. So essentially, you started from a very high-level overview and you went down to very minute details within the same interface. So yeah, and then again, there is so much literature, I must remind you, on this that shows the importance of showing overviews and details, but of also kind of highlighting connections and context. So just to wrap up, because I've talked your ears off, when it comes down to curating a digitally material experience, you want to start by digitally capturing the materiality of your items, and you can do so by figuring out their properties and affordances, finding out how to represent those in a way that steps away from typical digital aesthetics, and then handling as many real-life users and scenarios as possible. You then want to curate experiences out of collections of these items by providing users with both an overview and details, and also localizing the items in relation to each other and within the broader context in which they exist beyond the digital space. And ideally, you want to do all of this using an immersive and engaging user interface. And only then can you say you've created an experience that allows people to truly connect and interact with these items, as well as representing them beyond just the visuals and all of their glory. Thank you. And you can feel free to ask any questions now.
اوكي مالك، هناخد سؤال واحد عشان بس الوقت، نشوف في حد رافع ايده. اتفضل يا سيف.
اوكي انا صوتي طالع؟ انا كنت عايز اسال الاول، توك حلوه جدا، شكرا يا ملك. كنت عايز اسال هل في اصلا ناس بتستخدم فكره ان تدخل الماتيريال في اليو اي بتاع برودكت معين، اللي هو بس ريسيرش ومفيش حد بيستخدمه كابليكيشن؟ ويعني فولو اب برضه سريع، ان يعني انا عجبتني اليو اي بتاعت اللايبرري اللي قلت عليه، بس هل دي مجرد الاكسبيرمنت وما حد يجربها هناخد منه فيدباك، ولا هي بيزد على حاجه بس؟ شكرا.
اوكي. هو الشورت انسر هو انه في مصر مفيش قوي حد بيعمل كده. هو ده اكتر في كام ويب سايت بره مصر، يعني الموضوع لسه مش commercially very much used. It's more in the research phase, بس there are يعني examples زي اللي انا اديتهم في البرزنتيشن. دي كلها ويب سايتس that are live and usable، مش حاجات يعني concepts انا واخداها من حته. بس I think انه right now it's mainly being used زي ما قلت in museums, archives، عشان older items, their physical properties are very important to see and study and كده. But the thing is, if you start using them, for example, in like shopping platforms, as a girl, I imagine how many times I would have loved to kind of see the material of a dress, to see whether it's cotton or wool, or so on, or to see it on different body types, or so on. So I think there are insane commercial applications for this, even if it's still not that widespread. And then for the second half of the question, this is a real actual website. هي library في Oxford اسمها Digital Bodleian. ممكن اللينك بتاع الويب is under the thing on the slides. But it is actually in use. وهم عملوا user studies كتيرة في الموضوع، و it had a very positive experience عشان usually not a lot of people, especially younger people, will go and look at manuscripts and engage قوي مع historical items دي. But this has been very helpful in kind of engaging a lot of people, عشان at the end of the day anyone would be interested to see like the paper and how old it looks and so on, even if you're not a specialist. It helps engage a wider audience.
اوكي ملك، في سؤال بس كمان هناخده. ماشي، اتفضل يا احمد.
اوكي، شكرا يا ملك جدا على التوك. you really meet expectation يعني. كنت عايز اسال حاجتين سريعه جدا. اول حاجه because you did a great research, I think if you have example about education platform whatever يعني او education aspect, please mention it if you have now. عن حاجه عن اي بلاتفورم او ويب سايت او ابلكيشن عمل نفس اللي بتتكلمي عنه ده بس في education level. والحاجه الثانيه عايز اسال، هو الامبلمنتيشن الفيجوال بتاع التيبل على اير ميت اللي احنا عليه دلوقتي البلاتفورم دي، هل ده عشان ابقى فاهم صح، هل ده امبلمنتيشن حقيقي اللي بتقولي عليه ولا لا؟ يعني هل ده واحد من ضمن الاكزامبلز ممكن نعتبره؟
Okay, thank you. Honestly, I'm not aware of حاجة using it for in an educational setting. But I can imagine يعني to answer the second half of your question, yes. هو AirMeet أنا أول ما دخلت كنت حاسة لو إيه ده أنا عايزة أستعمل ده في البرزنتيشن بتاعتي، عشان it kind of gives you the experience of sitting at tables and only being able to speak with the people who are next to you, and so on. So it kind of recreates this experience, and it even does it without any fully visually, without audio or any other special equipment. But yes, this is a good example. I would say إنه مثلا a good example would be to recreate something like this as a classroom مثلا. وحتى Zoom, even with Zoom and other things, they use the metaphor of raise your hand. These kind of features which just bring the experience closer to real life. Instead of just typing out the question, you can kind of use the metaphor of raising a hand. So it's all these little kind of features that just bring you closer to a real world experience.
شكرا جدا.
Thank you يا ملك. السيشن كانت جميلة. ميرسي جدا.
ميرسي.
اوكي احنا كده خلصنا، ولو حد عنده اي questions تانية ممكن هيبعتلك in private بقى.
اوكي انا امشي ازاي ولا انتوا هتمشوني ولا؟
احنا هو هنعمل session.